The air in the courtroom is thick, heavy with anticipation. The only sound is the occasional shuffle of papers and the faint creak of the judge's chair. A 19-year-old teenager stands at the defense table, his hands casually tucked into his pockets. His expression is unreadable, neither nervous nor defiant, just patient, as if he knows something the rest of the room doesn't. Judge Albert Grayson leans back in his chair, an amused smirk curling at the corner of his lips. He adjusts his glasses and studies the boy standing before him. "You think this is a game, kid?" The question is met with soft chuckles rippling through the courtroom. The bailiff, prosecutor, even the stenographer exchange amused glances. The scene is almost comical, an inexperienced teenager standing alone against the weight of the justice system. But what they don't know is that this teenager is no ordinary defendant. He doesn't flinch, he doesn't react. He just stands there, steady, as if waiting for the perfect moment. But who is this kid, and why does he look like he's the one in control? The courtroom settles, the murmurs dying down as Prosecutor Ronald Pierce rises from his seat. He exudes confidence, his suit is pristine, his tie perfectly knotted. He adjusts his cuffs before stepping forward with the air of a man who has done this 1,000 times before. Clearing his throat, he speaks, his voice measured, deliberate. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this case is simple. The defendant, Jalen Carter, was caught inside a stolen vehicle." He lets the words hang for effect before continuing. Prosecutor Pierce. His fingerprints were found on the steering wheel. When officers approached, he ran. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. Guilt. Open and shut case. A few spectators nod in agreement, the logic seeming airtight. For a moment, it feels like the case is already decided. Judge Grayson barely looks up, flipping lazily through the case file before exhaling heavily. He looks bored. "All right, let's move this along. I have lunch reservations." A ripple of laughter runs through the courtroom. Casual, dismissive. To them, this is routine. Just another young man in a bad situation, another name to check off the docket. No need to overthink it. But one person isn't laughing. Jalen Carter remains completely still. He doesn't shift uncomfortably, doesn't fidget with his suit, doesn't react at all. His face remains unreadable. For the first time, a few people in the courtroom start to take notice. Why isn't he nervous? Even the jury glances at him, expecting some sort of reaction. A flinch, a defensive expression, anything. But there's nothing. Instead, Jalen slowly lifts his gaze, his dark eyes meeting the prosecutor's with unsettling steadiness. Pierce hesitates, just for a fraction of a second, but enough that someone watching closely would notice. The prosecutor lays out the case with confidence. The judge is barely paying attention. The jury has already made up its mind, so why does Jalen Carter look so calm? The tension in the room shifts, subtly, but noticeably. Something is about to happen. The courtroom was buzzing with whispered conversations, the weight of the prosecutor's words still hanging in the air. The judge barely concealed his boredom, tapping his fingers lazily against his desk. Jalen Carter stood motionless at the defendant's table, his hands still tucked into his pockets, his expression unreadable. He hadn't reacted to the prosecution's claims, nor had he turned to his public defender for guidance. It was as if he wasn't even concerned. Judge Grayson sighed, shifting in his chair. "Well, does the defense have anything to say?" A long pause. Then, in a voice calm, clear and unwavering, Jalen finally spoke. "Your Honor, I will be representing myself." Silence. For a moment it seemed as if the entire courtroom had been placed on pause. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the sound of the ceiling fan overhead suddenly seemed deafening. Then, a wave of murmurs, gasps, and hushed exclamations rolled through the audience. The stenographer, who had been mechanically typing the entire time, faltered for the briefest second. The bailiff raised an eyebrow. Even the prosecutor, Ronald Pierce, who had been wearing a smug expression all morning, blinked in mild surprise before letting out a short, disbelieving chuckle. "Well, this should be interesting." Judge Grayson, who had been leaning back in his chair for most of the trial, suddenly straightened. He narrowed his eyes at Jalen, studying him with newfound curiosity. "Excuse me?" Jalen nodded once. "I said, I will be defending myself." This time there was no laughter, no amused chuckles from the gallery. The weight of his words settled over the room. Judge Grayson let out a slow breath, rubbing his temple. "Son, this is a court of law, not a school debate tournament. Do you even understand the magnitude of what you're doing?" Jalen's gaze remained steady. "I do." The judge glanced at the public defender sitting next to Jalen, a woman who looked more than relieved to step away from this case. He sighed again. "Very well, if that's what you want." From the prosecution's table, Pierce smirked. "This kid really thinks he's some kind of prodigy," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jalen to hear. "This is going to be fun." Jalen didn't react, but deep inside he knew Pierce had just made his first mistake. Jalen stepped forward, slow and deliberate. His movements were precise, confident, but not arrogant. There was a calculated ease to him, something almost unnerving. "Before I begin, I'd like to clarify something with the prosecution." Pierce raised an eyebrow, still amused. "Go ahead, counselor." Jalen took another step forward. "You stated that Officer Daniels personally saw me behind the wheel of the stolen vehicle, correct?" Pierce rolled his eyes. "That's right." Jalen tilted his head slightly. "And that statement is included in his official police report?" Pierce sighed dramatically, pretending to be bored. "Yes, kid. That's what official statement means." Jalen nodded. "Good, because I'd like to submit a request for the court to verify Officer Daniels' GPS logs from that night." A flicker of confusion crossed Pierce's face. "What?" Jalen's expression remained neutral. "If Officer Daniels was indeed present at the time of my arrest, then his GPS logs should confirm his location." Judge Grayson leaned forward. "And if they don't?" Jalen's lips curled into the faintest of smirks. "Then it means the prosecution's key witness wasn't even in the area when the alleged crime took place." The courtroom erupted again. For the first time since the trial had begun, Pierce's confidence wavered. He glanced down at his notes, flipping through pages, searching for something, anything, to refute Jalen's claim. Nothing, because Jalen wasn't guessing. He knew. Judge Grayson rapped his gavel against the desk. "Order." The murmurs died down, but the air was charged now, electric with curiosity, with uncertainty. The people in that room were no longer just spectators to another routine case. They were witnessing something unexpected, something rare. Judge Grayson turned to Pierce. "Mr. Pierce, does the prosecution have any objections to verifying Officer Daniels' location on the night in question?" Pierce hesitated. Too long, and that's when everyone in the courtroom knew. Jalen was onto something. Pierce cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is unnecessary. The officer's report speaks for itself." Jalen took another step forward. "Does it?" Pierce shot him a glare. "You're a defendant, not a lawyer." Jalen's smirk widened just slightly, and yet I seem to be the only one asking the right questions. A few muffled chuckles rippled through the gallery. Judge Grayson sighed, rubbing his temple again. He turned back to Pierce. "Counselor, are you saying you have an issue with verifying your own witness's credibility?" Pierce's jaw tightened. "No, Your Honor." The judge nodded. "Then let's proceed." As the bailiff moved to retrieve the requested records, Pierce sat back in his chair, but his posture was different now. His usual ease had disappeared, replaced by something sharper, more calculating. He had underestimated Jalen Carter, and now he knew it. Across the room, Jalen stood with the same unshakable calm he had carried since the moment he walked in. But there was something else in his expression now, a quiet, undeniable certainty. A 19-year-old just made the boldest move of his life. But the real question isn't if he's brave, it's if he actually knows what he's doing. The weight of the courtroom shifted. The energy, once dismissive and confident, had started to crack, just slightly. The murmurs from the audience died down as all eyes fixed on one person, Jalen Carter. He stood at the defense table, shoulders squared, expression neutral. But his eyes? They were sharp, calculating, watching, waiting. Across the room, prosecutor Ronald Pierce adjusted his tie, still holding on to the confidence that had carried him through countless cases. But there was something in the air now, an undercurrent of uncertainty. Jalen turned, finally breaking the silence. Prosecutor says Officer Daniels saw me behind the wheel, correct? Pierce barely hesitated before responding. Yes, and it's in his report. Jalen exhaled slowly, nodding. He let the statement hang for just a beat too long enough for people to start anticipating something. Then he smirked. Interesting, because Officer Daniels wasn't even on duty that night. Then, the gallery erupted in gasps. The stenographer, whose fingers had been tapping mechanically against the keyboard, faltered. The bailiff shot a glance toward the judge, as if waiting for some kind of intervention. Judge Grayson's smirk, which had been present since the start of the trial, faded. And the prosecutor? His confidence cracked. Pierce's posture stiffened. His fingers gripped the edge of the table just slightly, his gaze flicking toward the case files before him. Searching. Jalen tilted his head. Something wrong, Mr. Pierce? The prosecutor forced a chuckle. This is ridiculous. The officer's statement is part of an official police report. Jalen raised an eyebrow. That doesn't answer my question. Was Officer Daniels on duty or not? The courtroom was silent now, hanging on to every word. Mr. Pierce, do you have a response? Pierce's lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he flipped through the report, scanning for something, anything, to counter what had just been said. Jalen folded his arms, his voice taking on a sharper edge. Question. If he wasn't working, then his testimony was either a mistake or a lie. Another ripple of whispers filled the courtroom. The judge ran a hand down his face, clearly frustrated. This case was supposed to be simple, but it wasn't. And everyone knew it now. Pierce cleared his throat. Your Honor, with all due respect, this is a distraction. The officer's statement aligns with the evidence. His testimony, Jalen cut him off, is invalid if he wasn't there. A sharp murmur of agreement from the audience. Even some members of the jury exchanged uncertain glances. Judge Grayson let out a deep sigh, rubbing his temple. All right, let's settle this now. He turned toward the bailiff. Have someone pull the officer's duty records. Pierce opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was cornered. Jalen leaned against the defense table, his expression calm, but his voice carried weight. You built your entire case around an officer's testimony, Mr. Pierce. If that foundation is a lie, what's left? The courtroom hung on to that question. Pierce knew he had to recover. Fast. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and turned to the judge. Your Honor, while we wait for those records, let's not ignore the other evidence. The defendant's fingerprints were found on the steering wheel of the stolen vehicle. Jalen smirked again. He had been waiting for this moment. Glad you brought that up. The tension thickened, because Jalen was about to expose something bigger. For the first time in the trial, the balance of power had shifted. Jalen wasn't playing defense anymore. He was attacking. The judge knew it. The prosecutor knew it. And the courtroom? They could feel it. The cracks in the prosecution's case were growing wider, and Jalen was about to drive a wedge right through them. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. The cracks in the prosecution's case had begun to show, and everyone could feel it. Prosecutor Pierce, however, was not ready to back down. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and took a step toward the jury. Prosecutor Pierce firmly. Fine. Let's say the officer's testimony is called into question. That doesn't change the fact that the defendant's fingerprints were found on the stolen vehicle. He let the statement settle, watching the jury for their reactions. Then, turning to Jalen, he crossed his arms. So tell us, Mr. Carter, how do you explain that? All eyes shifted to Jalen. This was a pivotal moment. The courtroom was holding its breath, waiting for him to stumble, to show even the slightest sign of weakness. But he didn't. Instead, he turned. Not to the prosecutor, not to the judge, but directly to the jury. A pause. Then, in a voice measured and calm, he spoke. "If you walk into a clothing store, try on a jacket, zip it up, put your hands in the pockets." He took a step closer to them, locking eyes with each juror, his voice unwavering. "And then leave without buying it. But later, someone steals that same jacket. Does that mean you are guilty of theft?" A ripple of uncertainty passed through the jury box. Some members shifted in their seats. A few exchanged glances, the doubt creeping into their expressions. One juror, an older man, furrowed his brow as if reconsidering everything he had assumed so far. Jalen let the silence stretch just long enough before delivering the final blow. "Your identity. Prosecution wants you to believe that touching something makes you a criminal. But is that really justice?" For the first time since the trial had started, the jury wasn't so sure anymore. The courtroom, which had been buzzing with murmurs just moments ago, fell into an eerie silence. Jalen Carter stood firm, his posture unwavering as he reached for a document from the defense table. He held it up, his expression unreadable. "I'd like to submit a statement into evidence from the car's actual owner." The words sent an undeniable ripple through the courtroom. Judge Grayson, who had spent most of the trial dismissing Jalen's arguments, narrowed his eyes. He motioned for the bailiff to retrieve the document. The rustle of papers filled the air as the judge scanned the page. And then, the amusement was gone. The smirk had vanished. His lips pressed into a thin line, and his grip on the paper tightened. Jalen waited, watching the judge's reaction. He let the silence build before finally speaking again, his voice sharper than before. The owner of the vehicle provided a statement to the police the night his car was stolen. That statement was conveniently never mentioned by the prosecution. He took a step forward, his tone cutting through the thick silence. Because in that statement, the owner clearly described the person who stole his car. He turned, his gaze locking onto Pierce, the prosecutor, who had gone pale. And the owner told police that the thief was white. A collective gasp rippled through the room. A few jurors visibly stiffened. Jalen let the words sink in. Then, the final blow. "I am not white." The courtroom was silent, not a single sound. No whispers, no murmurs. Just the undeniable truth hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Even Judge Grayson, who had dismissed this case as routine, looked like he had just been hit with a realization too big to ignore. A question now echoed through every mind in that courtroom. How many others had been wrongfully accused? A heavy silence settled over the courtroom, thick and suffocating. Prosecutor Ronald Pierce stood frozen behind his table, gripping the edge of his notes. His fingers twitched as he frantically flipped through page after page, searching for something, anything, to counter what had just been revealed. But there was nothing. The case that had once seemed like an easy conviction was now falling apart at the seams. Judge Grayson leaned back in his chair, then slowly removed his glasses. He pinched the bridge of his nose, exhaling deeply, a long, weary sigh that carried the weight of realization. The entire courtroom waited. The reporters in the back gripped their pens tighter, ready to capture the next words that would leave the judge's mouth. Jurors stared, some in shock, others in quiet reflection. And Jalen Carter? He didn't move, didn't react, because he already knew what was coming. Judge Grayson tapped his fingers against the desk, his gaze shifting from the prosecution to the defense. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned forward and spoke. His voice was quieter than before, but filled with finality. "Judge Grayson," firmly, "this court finds that the prosecution has failed to meet its burden of proof." A pause. The tension in the room reached its peak. Then, "The case is dismissed." For a split second, no one moved. Then chaos. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads, some reaching for their phones to break the news. In the gallery, some spectators shook their heads in disbelief, while others nodded in silent approval. Pierce's face turned pale. His mouth opened slightly as if to protest, but he knew it was useless. He had lost. Jalen finally exhaled, a slow and steady breath, then tucked his hands back into his pockets. He had won, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The courtroom was still buzzing. The weight of the verdict, case dismissed, hung in the air like an echo refusing to fade. Jalen Carter remained still for a moment, taking it all in. The gasps, the murmurs, the furious scratching of reporters' pens. None of it mattered anymore. He had known the truth all along. With a slow, measured breath, he turned on his heel and began walking toward the exit. But just as he reached the door, "Mr. Carter." Jalen stopped. For a brief moment, he didn't turn around. The entire courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Even the prosecutor, still standing at his table in stunned disbelief, glanced up. Jalen finally shifted, but only slightly. His posture relaxed, as if he had already moved beyond this place, this moment. The judge hesitated. His fingers tapped lightly against the desk, a stark contrast to the confident, dismissive man he had been when the trial started. Something had changed. A beat of silence. Then, "You should consider law school." The words landed like an unexpected verdict of their own, not one of guilt or innocence, but recognition. Jalen didn't react right away. Then slowly, his lips curled into a faint smirk. He turned his head just slightly, his voice calm, assured. "Jalen Carter, already am, Your Honor." And with that, he walked out. The courtroom, for the first time since the trial began, was truly silent. But the story? Far from over. The final message and call to action. This wasn't just one case, this was a system exposed. How many people are convicted? Not because they're guilty, but because they don't have the knowledge to fight back. If this story made you think, share it, because next time it might not be Jalen, it might be someone you know. Like, comment, subscribe. Let's keep this conversation going. Justice matters.